everybody, Jessica Williams here, back again with another episode of the Gateway to Imagia, the Tale of Sam Little. Today I will be reading chapter 10 and moving on with the story. Hope you're enjoying, but we're going to go ahead and get started, okay? This is chapter 10, The Gateway. Though they had only spent one day and night there, it was strange to be leaving Orga's home. Sam had felt oddly safe there. Before meeting Orga, he was blind to what the world was. He had planned to stay for a while and then return home of his own accord. All of his plans were jumbled up now. Each creature or person that Sam had met so far he had befriended, and each one found a place and a purpose in the group. Among the few things he was certain of was that Orga would be joining them on their journey back to his gateway. His knowledge of Imagia would prove to be useful, and the stories he could tell were sure to be fascinating. So when Orga stayed behind, Sam was incredibly disappointed. He still had so many questions to ask. He had spent the night fighting sleep. Every time he would feel himself slipping into his dreams, he would force himself awake with a jolt. Many a time he was unsuccessful and had to be woken by the nearest individual if he started to scream. But the night didn't last forever. Daylight had come to the forest, and at last Sam and his friends were once again traveling through their expanses. Now that he had left, Sam wished he'd spent his night more productively. Orga wasn't there to whet his desire for knowledge, and now the only one left to answer his questions was Taryn, who was far from wordy when it came to explaining things. He hadn't the same vast knowledge that Orga had, and he admitted to this up front when they started the long trek back. He explained to Sam that he would do his best to answer any questions he had, but couldn't promise his efficiency in doing so. Sam had yet to ask Taryn about his sad tale. He had a feeling that Taryn might not be as willing to divulge that information now that they were on their way. For a good while after setting out, the conversation was sparse. Sam didn't really know quite where to start and was still struggling with his decision to leave Imagia behind him. And more importantly, he was fighting with the idea of leaving Yetus to an unknown fate. Yetus saw the burden of worry and doubt that Sam carried now. He was completely aware that Sam felt remorse for his choice. He also knew that Sam didn't want anyone to know just how much it bothered him. He tried to break the awkwardness by being as playful and upbeat as he could. His attempt was at least partially successful because Sam agreed to ride in his usual place atop Yetus's shoulders. As for Kisa, she had become much more sullen. Before they set off for their return journey, she asked to go with them. She offered herself as another form of protection for Sam. Though mourning for her lost cubs, when Sam accepted her offer, she seemed to benefit from her new purpose. There was renewed light in her eyes. As they trudged along in silence, Sam's mind began to wander. He dwelled on the most recent thought of his last moments with Orga. "Aren't you coming too?" Sam had asked when he noticed that Orga wasn't making any preparations to leave his home. Orga smiled widely and once more placed his elongated fingers over Sam's shoulders. Sam would never forget how warm they felt through his borrowed clothes.
"I have no purpose in this part of your journey. I believe that you will make it back to your gateway safely. I would trust Taryn with my own life."
He chuckled, and Sam watched as his large jowl jiggled.
"In fact, I have trusted him with mine many times. He's the best protector I've ever met. You'll be plenty safe with him."
Everyone seemed to be more worried about his safety than he was. That was what kept driving him back to his gateway. His decision wasn't based nearly as much on his fear of being left behind and never going home, but rather based on the concern that he couldn't see. There was a nagging sensation that frightened Sam when the others would mention how dangerous a position he was now in. Soon enough, he'd be securely tucked away in his boring bed with no more real adventures to ever put his small life in jeopardy again. Imagia definitely had more appeal to him than his normal life, but he couldn't stay. The fear he felt, though masked at the moment, was always looming. Sam was staring at the flower that he had imagined into existence.
"I know what you are thinking, Sam,"
Orga said.
"You do have an extraordinary power. But you are also very young and quite vulnerable to the ways of this world. I will admit to you that I will always wonder if another child like you will come along one day and be able to return Imagia to its true purpose. But it is not your world to save. You do not need to feel guilt for leaving. It is the way it is supposed to be. You are meant to return home."
I know. It's just that, well, what if I could help? If one kid could come here and make things go so bad, then can't one kid come here that could make things go good again? What if I'm that kid?
Orga shrugged. "There's no way to know. But don't dwell on what could be. You are too young to worry so much. For now, just remember your time here as your grandest adventure. Yetus will always remember you, as will those you have met along the way. After a few days home, you will begin to think of this world as a beautiful dream. The dream will grow dim with time, and then eventually you will forget."
"But I don't want to forget," said Sam.
"It is simply the way of this world. No child ever wants to forget, but they always do. You will too."
"But how do you know?"
"Because I'm a guardian. I'm supposed to know,"
Orga answered matter-of-factly. Orga handed him a roughly woven sack filled with food and water. He patted him on the shoulder one last time and said,
"Sometimes it is a good thing to be able to forget. I don't believe I will ever forget you, though."
With a final smile, he said,
"Be safe, Sam Little."
As Sam remembered Orga's last words, he knew that he meant them to be comforting. But as hard as he tried to let it ease his mind, it simply wasn't working. He never wanted to forget anyone he had met or the awesomeness of Imagia. Forgetting was too painful. He thought about what it would be like to walk back through his gateway. Seeing Yetus standing there and waving goodbye to him would be harder than anything he had ever done. He wondered if Titus would be waiting there for him just as he was the night he left. Getting here seemed so easy. Could leaving be just as easy if it is the way that Imagia works? And how could Orga be so certain that Sam would forget? How do you merely forget something as incredible as an imaginary world brought to life? Forgetting didn't even seem close to the realm of possibilities. Yetus yawned and grumbled a question to Sam. Sam popped out of his dazed state. I was going to ask him soon, but he might not want to talk about losing his guardian. Yetus nodded and sighed. You think I should still ask him then? Yetus turned to look up at Sam and gestured with one of his hands towards Terran. Okay, so what should I say? He whispered back. Yetus made his suggestion clear with a long grunt. Sam rolled his eyes. Yeah, I guess that's a good idea, but what if he doesn't want to start at the beginning? Yetus shrugged and lifted Sam off his shoulders. He nudged him gently forward so that he would be walking next to Terran. Terran looked down at Sam and smiled knowingly. You're going to ask me about my story, aren't you? Sam blushed slightly, realizing that his conversation with Yetus was not as private as he thought it had been. Well, yeah, if that's still okay. He looked up, hoping not to see any sign of sadness in Terran's face. I told you I would share it with you on our journey home. I won't go back on my word. But you should know that I'm not a very good storyteller. Sam nodded eagerly. He couldn't seem to hide the smile that was itching under the surface. Well, let me see. I guess you probably want to know how I got here. Well, yeah. Well, as ridiculous as it sounds to say it out loud,
I wished on a shooting star. I was 8 years old. Much like you, I wished my imagination was real, and the next day, I was here."
Sam got overly excited and interrupted Taryn with a flood of questions. "What did you see? Who was your guardian? What was he like? Did you go through a forest too?" He looked up at Taryn and saw him looking back with a raised eyebrow.
"Do you want to hear my story, or would you just rather keep asking questions?" He smirked.
"Sorry. Go ahead." Sam was mildly embarrassed. Taryn smiled again and resumed his tale.
"First of all, I suppose you should know that I had a twin sister. Her name was Tessa. We both used to go together on imaginary adventures when we were growing up. We talked about how amazing it would be if it were real. One evening, we were sitting outside stargazing, and agreed that the next shooting star we saw, well, we both wished that our imaginations and our adventures would become real. The next evening, we saw our guardians, standing at the edge of the woods not far from where we lived. Of course, we didn't know what they truly were, but we went to them nonetheless."
"What did they look like?" Sam asked. He smiled solemnly as he remembered.
"They were tigers, actually. Mine was white, and his name was Tiberius. He was incredibly beautiful. And unlike Yetu's, he was perfectly understandable," he joked.
He paused long enough to watch Yetus roll his eyes, and then continued.
"Tessa's tiger was orange, and her name was Atlantis. Of course, one gateway can only bring one child, so our guardians led us to separate places in the trees, and then suddenly we were both here. It's not common for two to come together like that, but it does happen from time to time. So here we were, two naive 8-year-olds riding on our tigers. We had no idea we'd entered a world in the midst of dangerous times. We'd only been here for 2 days when things took a turn for the worse."
Taryn drifted off and got a faraway look in his eyes. He shook his head as if shaking off a bad thought, and then continued.
"Out of nowhere we were attacked. It happened so fast that there was nothing we could have done. The only warning we had was a massive shadow that covered us in darkness before it landed. It was a dragon. Our guardians fought it the best they could, but it was a hopeless battle. Tessa and I stood helpless in the shadows of the trees and watched as the dragon killed Atlantis. Tiberius kept fighting. He was so brave."
Sam watched Taryn closely. He could tell it was hard for him to relive that day. He felt guilty for asking to hear his story. He thought about asking him to stop, but so badly wanted to hear more.
"Tiberius got in a few good hits, but it didn't matter in the end. He died too. The dragon flew away, leaving us behind, and of course we had no idea what any of this meant, and that we would be trapped here forever. We sat by our fallen guardians, scared and alone. We were there for hours before anyone found us. Tessa was inconsolable. She wouldn't stop crying, and all I could do was hold her and try to tell her that it would be okay. Just when I had decided that we'd better find our way home is when I met Orga for the first time."
Taryn smiled warmly.
"He happened upon us by chance and felt pity. We told him our story, and he told us about Imagia. When Tessa found out that we were never going home again, she went into shock. Orga took us to his home, did what he could for us. He sort of took us under his wing. He truly is an amazing being. So the years went by, and Tessa never got better. She slept a lot, and that's when the nightmares started. I, on the other hand, chose to go out and start to explore the world. Orga watched over us for a long time, but eventually I felt it was time to leave. In my travels I came across a village full of people who had suffered the same fate we had."
"A village of kids?" Sam squeaked in surprise. "How many kids are stuck here?" Taryn shook his head slowly.
"Well, they aren't all kids, Sam. Many of them are grown now. Time ages us differently here, but we do still grow. When a child is left behind, they eventually end up in a place that I found. They call it the Village of Exile."
He caught the flicker of confusion on Sam's face and explained.
"Exile means to be sent away from someplace, and not allowed to return."
"Oh," answered Sam. He understood, and it made him sad. He noticed Sam's sad expression.
"The name is fitting, really, and it is sad, but a lot of us adjusted fairly well. We learn to cope with the nightmares and restless sleep, and it's a tragic fate for any child to become lost here. They enter this world in joy only to be thrown into a nightmare. It pains me to see it happen so many times. That's what ultimately drove me to become a protector. From the first moment I saw a protector defend a guardian as she returned her child safely home, I knew it's what I wanted to become. I learned from other protectors and started going out and finding guardians as they brought their children into the world. I would do my best to explain to them that they had to take their children back to their gateways as soon as they could. I watched over them, kept them both safe, and after their child is safely returned, I teach the guardians how to hide and what to avoid. Unfortunately, there aren't enough protectors to help everyone. But we do what we can. If we're too late and we find a lost child, we take them to the Village of Exile. There, they are well cared for by the others. It's a place where compassion for the lost ones is not lacking."
Sam didn't look at Taryn as he thought about what he'd heard. It was making his decision to go home seem simpler. Taryn watched the concern in Sam's face. He continued.
"Anyhow, as far as my story goes, I'm afraid there isn't much else to tell. It's not a pleasant story for me to remember, but it happened a very long time ago. Time heals all wounds, so they say."
Sam looked at him curiously. Taryn looked so young, but sounded so wise to him. He wondered how long ago Taryn had gotten trapped in Imagia. "How long have you been here? I mean, you don't look very old." Taryn laughed in response to Sam's observation skills.
"Well, as I said before, time is different here. I don't think there is anyone here who could unravel the mysteries of Imagia, not even Nadaroth. But you have to remember that children were not meant to exist here permanently. All I know is that after a certain time, I simply stopped changing. I've looked like this for a very long time."
"So how old are you?"
"Well, I've been in Imagia for 164 years. That would make me 172 years old."
"Whoa! No way! You are super old! That's older than my grandpa! But you don't look like him at all! You're not wrinkly or anything!" Yatu snorted behind them, and they all started laughing at Sam's candid comment. Taryn nodded.
"But I bet your grandpa didn't grow up in a strange world built by the power of imagination, so he has a good excuse for not looking like a 25-year-old. I bet your grandpa never battled a Deceptor or a dragon either." He winked. They were all amazed by this new revelation. Another piece of Imagia had been revealed. With Taryn's tale finally told and the mood of the group slightly uplifted, the outlook for the remainder of the journey had become significantly improved. And even though he was so close to leaving this world behind, there was a little extra bounce to Sam's walk for the moment. Yatus had been right about the length of time it would take to get to the gateway. He had just explained to Sam that they were very close and should be there fairly soon. After translating to Taryn and Kisa, Sam began to feel the imminent goodbye tugging at his heartstrings. It was unfair to leave so soon, and knowing now that he rightfully had 10 days to be here with his best friend made the pain of it worse. Sam had gotten tired of walking again, and had resumed his place atop Yatus. He wanted to treasure the last moments and remember exactly how everything felt. Taryn knew this was a hard moment for him and did his best to comfort him by encouraging him that it was the right decision.
He promised that he would do everything in his power to protect Yetus and that he was in good hands. He even got a smile from Sam when he joked that the language barrier might prove to be a bit annoying, but they'd just have to use some form of sign language to get by. The journey had gone smooth. They hadn't run into anything dangerous the entire time, and spirits were high for it. It was nearing evening of Sam's third day in Imagia when finally Yetus slowed to a stop. He looked up at Sam solemnly. He also felt the finality of the situation, and the sadness couldn't be shrouded easily from either of their faces. Yetus helped Sam down from his shoulders and watched him carefully. Sam looked away from Yetus's stare to observe where they were. He recognized the large flowery bush he had mock-ambushed, and the clearing where he and Yetus had lounged in the broken rays of sun. The path that had led them to Kisa was near as well, and he didn't know if he could get any words out through the lump swelling in his throat, so he sounded slightly muffled when he said, "So we're here then?" Yetus nodded and pointed over to the shadows of a tree. There, still hanging just as he had left it, was his red superhero cape. Under it sat his green frog flashlight. Now that he saw them, he understood that the time he had dreaded the entire day had come. He didn't feel finished with this amazing world, but also knew that it might be his only chance to leave. Yetus sheepishly grinned at his boy. He had brought him safely back, and now it was time to say the words that neither of them wanted to say. It was time to say goodbye. Taryn made the first move. He moved to Sam's side as they stared towards the dark trees. He put a hand on Sam's small shoulder. "I know this is hard for you, but try to remember that it's much safer for both of you this way." When Sam didn't say anything back, Taryn continued in a reassuring voice. "He'll be okay. And so will you," he finished with a smile. Sam looked up, and Taryn saw the conflict in his eyes. Kisa joined Sam at his other side and sat down on her haunches. "I'm very sorry that my journey with you ends, Sam. I've grown quite fond of you in the small time I've been allowed to know you." Sam looked into her crystal gaze. It would hurt to say goodbye to her, too. She was such a kind and wonderfully interesting creature to have befriended. "I'm sorry about your cubs, Kisa. I wish I could have helped you. Are you going to be all right?" As the Protector said, time heals. But don't be sorry. It was never your burden to bear." Her smile beamed through her saber teeth. "Good luck, Sam Little." She turned and allowed room for Yetus. Taryn followed suit. Yetus had stepped in front of Sam and bowed his head so that he could look into his eyes. Sam had taken to staring back down at his feet again. One silent tear fell and wet the ground below him. Yetus put a finger under Sam's chin and lovingly lifted his face. Tears were welling up, and Yetus smiled his goofy smile in encouragement, and Sam took one look into the big green eyes and jumped into Yetus's arms. He buried his face in the familiar fur as two large arms pulled him into a warm hug. Sam couldn't help but let out a large, muffled sniff as he fought back the tears. He wanted so badly to never let go and wished there was some way that Yetus could go with him. As the guardian held his child lovingly, there was a magical sound like the gentle tinkling of chimes in the wind as the gateway began to open mere feet away from him. Sam loosened his embrace on Yetus and gazed through the trees. It was as if he were looking through an open archway that led to his home world. He could see the lights of his house warmly glowing far across a long stretch of grass. The friendly glow beckoned to him as he watched from afar. It was still night in his world, still the same night he left mere days ago. All eyes were on Sam now. As they stood there in the evening light, more of the same magical sounds interrupted the scene. With Sam's gateway already open, they all looked around, confused by the source. A few yards from Sam's, another gateway had opened. A dazzling white unicorn was walking to the opening. It disappeared through the gateway for only a moment before it returned. It stood at the gateway and watched quietly, waiting. It lowered its gorgeous head serenely in expectation of something unseen to the small group of bystanders. A small girl came running through the gateway and threw her arms around the neck of the newly born guardian. The four travelers stood and watched as the girl's gateway dissolved back into the dark tree line. As the girl unwrapped her arms from the unicorn, Sam instantly recognized her. It was a girl from his school. Though they weren't in the same class, he knew her name. He whispered to Taryn, "I know her. Her name's Elizabeth." Taryn looked down at Sam with a mix of confusion mingled with surprise. He had apparently never seen two children who recognized each other from the outside world. He turned to watch the scene unfold with concern in his eyes for the newcomers. Kisa muttered, "Truly amazing." Taryn, obviously concerned for the situation, motioned for Sam to get to his gateway.
"You better go, kid."
Taryn barely got the words out when suddenly the trees behind them bent and thrashed violently. It was only a brief warning of what was coming. Too brief. The same strange and menacing beast from Sam's nightmare broke through the foliage and stopped only long enough to bare its fanged jaws and roar its deafening roar. It found its target all too easily and barreled towards the girl and the guardian, destroying the peaceful scene. Taryn drew his bow instantly and took aim. He shouted over his shoulder to Yetus,
"Get Sam out of here, now!"
The creature heard Taryn, and its eyes flicked briefly to them. It wasn't enough to distract him from his goal, and he dived for the unicorn. The guardian pushed the girl out of the way with its flank and reared on its hind legs. It shook its head and neighed, then aimed its shining golden horn for the heart of the beast. Sam saw the fear in the girl's face and ran to take her hand and pull her out of the way. Yetus had grabbed for Sam to hold him back, but only managed to catch air. Taryn shot at the beast, and it was a direct hit, and it roared in rage as it stumbled forward towards the unicorn with its sharp teeth aimed at its primary target. The unicorn fell under the weight of the beast as a rain of arrows pierced the attacker from behind. The protector's aim left the beast instantly dead. Yetus had reached Sam and Elizabeth. They all watched in stunned terror as the fallen guardian whinnied feebly and breathed its last breath. Yetus was trembling in fear for watching one of his own kind struck down so brutally. The girl was sobbing into her free hand and shaking from head to toe, and Sam felt pain and pity for her as he watched her and held her hand. He looked at his gateway and then to her. No one would ever believe him if he tried to explain her disappearance. Taryn turned, out of breath. He looked at Yetus.
"The gateway is still open. He needs to go now before another attack. We have to get you out of here. Sam, you have to go now, before it's too late. If a guardian dies, the gateway seals itself instantly."
Elizabeth looked up at Sam through tear-filled eyes. Recognition washed over her face as she saw him. "Sam?" Fear shook her voice as she asked him, "What's happening? I'm so scared." Sam looked into her scared eyes and felt her fear. This could so easily be him, left to wander a strange world, unknowing and frightened. Time seemed to stand still as he realized what he had to do. He looked into his gateway, at his home in the distance. His heart was pounding so hard that he could feel his shirt moving with every beat. Taryn was shouting orders in the background, but they were muddled over his own thoughts. He looked to Yetus, whose eyes were so innocent and filled with panic. He had to do this before he could change his mind. He felt the girl's hand trembling in his as he started running towards his gateway, pulling her behind. He got to the gateway and heard Taryn yell to him,
"Sam, you have to let go of her. She can't go with you. The gateway won't allow two to go through."
Sam stopped dead in his tracks, mere inches from the opening, as he heard Yetus's words of warning. He looked back at his three friends' faces and said, "I know." He focused on Yetus's familiar green eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry." He turned to the bewildered girl and begged, "Please, tell my mom and dad that I'm okay." Taryn abruptly grasped what was happening and screamed,
"No, Sam!"
He sprinted towards him. Elizabeth's face was confused, and she had no time to react as Sam shoved her through his gateway. A sudden, unnatural gust of air ruffled Sam's hair as he watched the image of his home melt away, replaced by the dark shadows of the forest. He turned in time to see 3 stunned faces staring back at him. Taryn had stopped in mid-run. He looked into the small boy's eyes and whispered,
"Sam, what have you done?"
He looked to Yetus and saw the fear of the unknown washing over his features. Sam didn't know if he understood why he did it or what the consequences would be for his actions, but he did know that things were about to become serious. I don't know, he stuttered. Before his mind could catch up with his actions, the bushes where his gateway once stood began to shudder. 4 sets of eyes watched the shadows ahead as Taryn drew his bow again, waiting for what was coming. All right, that is chapter 10. As promised, I'm going to get a couple more chapters up so that we have a little bit of catch up done and that I can maybe continue on a bit of a more regular pace. Got lots of chapters. My book actually has, it's got 27 chapters. So we're on chapter 11 next. Hopefully I can get that one up soon too. But other than that, I hope you're enjoying. Remember, drop a comment, like the video, let me know if you're listening, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks for listening. Bye.